Chapter 2. Cassie was lying on her stomach on her bed, legs scissoring and whacking the mattress. Thump, thump, thump. Her body wanted to move. The air outside was shimmering with the last days of summer, but she'd made a promise to herself, such a secret promise that even her parents didn't know it. She'd promised, to her heart of hearts, that she would learn mathematics for Violetta. She squinted and frowned at the numbers and symbols dancing in front of her, trying to make them settle so that she could wrest their secrets from them. The language of the universe, Cassie. Dad had said a cool thing, that calculus was the maths of change, and since the world is always changing, it'd be smart for us to learn it. He had little else to say about it, though, because he'd been quoting someone and didn't know how to do calculus himself. She closed the hard, shiny cover of the textbook and opened it again, hoping that this time all the squiggles would coalesce into something she could understand. But they didn't. They remained stubborn, unknowable incantations. If only Julian had been here. Her anger with him had faded long ago, leaving only a sore, sad spot where Julian should have been. Perhaps he'd come home for the Easter holidays this year. Maybe. The sound of deep wing beats and a creaky "Gawk" made her leap off her bed and run outside. "Dad! Yellowtails!" Ben looked up from his runner beans and watched, smiling, as the pair of yellow-tailed black cockatoos winged their way across the sky. "Do you ever get lonely, Dad, when Mum's not around?" His blue eyes searched her face, and then a crinkly look came to his eyes, the one he got when he was thinking about things he liked. "I miss her sometimes, but I've got you with me." He put down his basket and came over to squeeze her in a hug. "I miss her too," she said. "I know you do, and she wishes she could be here with you." Cassie drew back so that she could look up into his face. "Why do you guys never have any more kids?" He straightened his arm out on her shoulders. "Because one was just right." "Benjamin!" She folded her arms. "You want a better answer?" "Yes." "Cassie, truth seeker, I've always loved that about you." She waited. "Well, we weren't super young parents, and we wanted to give you a few good years where it was just you. By the time we thought about having another kid, we found we couldn't. Which was all right, really. It meant your mum could stay where she was with work. It was a bit tricky for her, getting back into it after all those years she'd spent at home early on." Cassie frowned. "Was that answer a bit more complicated than you expected?" "More boring," she said. He laughed, and she scooted out from under his arms. The day was far too beautiful for any more maths. She hadn't been in the forest for weeks. The golden light and insect calls were enticing today. She wandered down the path, revelling in the warm breeze on her bare arms and the tinkle of tiny birds in the canopy. Maybe because she was walking more slowly than usual, or perhaps because a yellow robin began its insistent call just at the right time from the right spot. But she noticed a small track she'd not seen before, leading off to her right from the main path. Her heart did a little skip with the thrill of discovery, and she stepped onto the track. The path headed down towards the water. She followed it, leaping over bracken fronds, ducking under tangled shrubs, and around piles of shiny deer scats that appeared here and there along the way. Eventually, she reached the river, and the path turned to run along its ferny bank under tall manigums. After several minutes, with the forest growing dense around her, she thought of heading back, but the track began to climb, and she figured it'd be easier to follow it up to the road and walk home that way. But the track didn't lead to the road. Instead, it dipped again and headed deeper and deeper into a thicket of tea trees and paper bark. The forest bird calls sounded more distant now. Everything felt muffled and close. she found herself treading quietly, as though a single twig crack could awaken the ragged and twisted forms of the trees around her, and that she would not be welcome when they noticed her. On the other side of the thicket was a circular clearing of yellow grass ringed by white-barked manna gums. The forest was dark all around it, and sunbeams angled into the grassy space. There was movement in the clearing. She ducked behind a patch of tall bracken, her heart loud in her ears. 2 shining creatures stood within the circle. At first she took them for small black horses, but quickly realized they were in fact tall hounds, slick and wolf-like. She knew so little about dogs that she couldn't even guess at the breed. One began nudging and circling the other, who was sitting on its haunches, and she watched fascinated as the other got to its feet, and together they began a kind of slow-motion play, tails wagging, bodies rising, falling, circling, mesmerizing Cassie with their strange and graceful dance. It felt like hours, though it may only have been minutes, before the larger of the 2 raised its nose to the air as though it had caught the scent of something. It took a moment for her to realize that the scent was likely her own. Shivers ran cold up and down her arms. She edged back towards the tea trees, cursing the cracking bracken beneath her feet. And as soon as she reached the thicket, turned and ran. A long, low howl started up behind her. She screamed and tore along the track, tripping and stumbling over roots and deer poo, past whipping, scratching branches, fearful that at any moment she would hear the pounding of paws against the ground behind her or feel claws ripping into her back. Finally, she reached the main path and swung towards home, running faster than she ever had before. She thrust open the gate, raced through the back garden, where there was no sign at all of Dad, ran into the house, slammed the door, and raced upstairs to the safety of her bedroom. Cassie didn't tell Dad about the dogs. She wasn't sure why she didn't. Perhaps it was because the whole event felt like a dream, a bubble of a world within this world, something she couldn't hold on to or examine because it was a shimmering thing slipping up and away from her. And she might have thought it a dream if it weren't for her heart that was still thumping or the sweat that was cooling and tingling now on her upper lip. "Cassie!" It was Dad's voice from the study. She took in a deep breath and blew it out, ran her fingers through her hair. 4 or 5 dried leaves were tangled into her curls. Cinnamon curls, her mum called them, for the mid-brown colour of cassia bark that was the exact shade of Cassie's hair. Cassie had always presumed Lyra was describing their colour and not their scent. It had never occurred to her to ask. She could smell the forest's resinous fragrance in her room, more eucalyptus than cinnamon, a spicy, wild scent. She pulled out the tiny leaves and laid them one by one along the windowsill. "Cassie, can you come here a minute?" "Coming!" Dad's study was one of Cassie's favourite places. She loved the way the sun hit the mud brick walls in the afternoon. At this angle, the light lit up the little white shells that he and Mum had placed inside the bricks and which, for years, Cassie had thought were fossils. He had papers lying across one side of his desk next to his PC. On the other side were wooden figurines at various stages of creation, and on the low shelf behind his desk was one of Cassie he'd finished years ago. She loved its smoothness, the rounded cheeks of the girl she was, and the way he'd worked the grains of the wood so that they looked like fine strands of wispy toddler hair. "I've just been on the phone to Mum." Cassie frowned. There was something strained about him, a tightness in his voice. "Is she okay?" "Oh, yes, she's okay. She's just—" "They need her to stay on site longer, for another fortnight. It's a big project. They're all running to a deadline and there are going to be some long hours in the office." "Cassie, don't. Cassie!" Cassie was hammering her fist into the wall. She couldn't help it. It felt good to pummel something, and it helped to drain away the shaky energy left in her body from the forest. I know you miss her. She doesn't want to stay. It'll just mean she doesn't have to go in after that for a good while once the project's done. Cassie, please stop. It was the quiet sadness in Dad's voice that brought Cassie up short. She stopped her hammering and leaned against the wall. Dad, I know, darling, we're both going to miss her. He sighed. There's one other thing, though. Cassie glared at him, and he seemed to flinch as he turned back to the computer screen. Mum agrees with me that we need a tutor. What? We're both worried that you're not where you should be in your studies. At school they're doing their VCE year at your age. The world began to spin. But you can teach me. You know I'm not good at that sort of stuff, really. Yes, you are. You teach me heaps. Look, it's either this or school. Cassie widened her eyes as she stared at her dad sitting so meekly in his office chair. Dad, what have you been looking up? Well, that's what I wanted to show you. He shifted the screen towards her. The face of a young woman stared out from an oval-cropped photograph. She looked, and Cassie hated she was even thinking this, cool. Her hair was short and black, pixie-ish. She wore a green jacket over an old-world lacy top. Her eyes were the weirdest colour Cassie had ever seen, a shining grey that was almost silver. Who is she? Dad must have noticed the begrudging admiration in her voice, because she felt the tightness in him ease a little and his voice soften out. Maybe your new tutor? What do you reckon? Her name's Elisa, but she says you can call her Allie for short. That night, Cassie threw open her window. The sky was a dark velvet. On the horizon, behind the great hulk of the forested hill across the valley, she could just see the yellow glow of the rising moon. Within minutes, its molten edge was silhouetting the outer canopies of the tall mountain trees, rising above them with spectacular speed, as though impatient to get to its night's duties. This was the moment Cassie had been waiting for. It was one of the few times she could feel the earth turning. The moon wasn't rising, she was falling forwards, head over heels. She felt herself somersaulting through the sky until the moon was lost above the jutting beams of the roof. She threw herself onto her bed. A tutor. Maybe it'd be good. Maybe. There was a hollow feeling in her chest. Her mother's face flashed across the black screen of her mind. For that moment she saw her clearly. Her long auburn hair, straight though, not wavy like her own. Her hazel eyes, sometimes blue, sometimes green, and the way her cheeks indented and curved around her mouth when she smiled. Lyra was a eucalypt, and she was the Cassie who lived in her branches. There'd been a time, long ago, when her mother had taken her everywhere, carried her against her body wherever she went, the shops, the garden, the forest. To this day the rhythm of her walking heartbeat, of sunlight flashing through trees, was what Cassie returned to when she needed to feel safe. 2 weeks. Too long. She knew enough about normal teenagers to know that most people her age longed to be away from their parents. But she had never felt that way with Lyra. With her mother nearby, things felt easy and magical, and everything made sense. Without her, the world was a little less bright, a little less golden. She would once have visited Julian, confided in him. He would have had her spilling out her fears and worries so that they could both see them. He'd always had a way of fashioning heavy things into smaller pieces that were easier to carry. But, of course, Julian wasn't here. Just sad old Mr. Walcott, who'd sent his son to the lions. Old anger like lava welled up from her stomach. She should tell him he'd done a bad thing, sending his son away. tell him that Julian was going to die being trapped like that. But of course, she could never tell John Walcott these things, any more than she could convince Dad that she didn't need a tutor, or Mum that she should come home. Chapter 3. The day the tutor arrived was not one of Cassie's finest, even by her own standards. Dad hadn't been able to entice her from her bedroom all morning. He tried the help me in the garden card with a new row of late basil that needed planting out, and then, when that hadn't worked, he'd banged around in the kitchen downstairs, whipping up his specialties, melted cheese muffins and banana smoothie. But Cassie was unmoved. The grey drizzle outside matched her mood. She lay on her bed, making animal patterns out of the wood grain in the roofing boards above her head. The eyes of crocodile, fox, and whale all seemed appropriately mournful. Eventually, Ben started streaming music from the study. Blaring jigs and reels and folky fiddle tunes battered at her ears. She tore open her bedroom door. "Turn that down!" Her dad's grinning face appeared from around his doorframe. "You look stupid." She regretted her words as soon as they'd left her mouth, but she still wanted to yell at him, so she banged her door shut again. He turned the music down, but not before Cassie had picked up her maths textbook and thrown it across the room. It landed like an injured bird, its white dove-wing pages all sad and askew against the skirting board as the music stopped. Then the doorbell rang. Though she would never quite know whether her new tutor had waited until the rumpus had died down before ringing the bell, or whether her timing was simply a fortuitous accident, the memory of their first encounter would always douse Cassie with a hot wash of shame. Cassie watched from the top of the stairs as Dad opened the door. She could just see the top of the tutor's head. Her hair looked as it had in the photo, dark and cropped short. Her skin was pale and smooth, like one of those TV ad models who'd bathed in dandelion milk soap or some other ridiculous ingredient. Dad finished his greeting and stepped aside to usher her in. Before she was fully prepared for it, the tutor's strange silver gaze located Cassie leaning against the banister. "Hello, Cassie. I'm Allie." Her voice was a surprise. It was the voice of someone who knew what it was like to be alone and to like it. The voice of someone approaching a deer in a forest, quiet and shaped like a river, with no sharp edges. Dad jumped into the silence that followed with his happy mode on. "Well, shall we go hang in the kitchen? Cassie and I were about to have a bite to eat. Why don't you join us?" "Sure, I'd love to," Allie winked at Cassie. Before this, Cassie would have said, had anyone asked, that the time between introduction and first wink should be at least a month. Yet, somehow, this wink felt okay. Good, even. As though she was being let into a secret club. She followed them into the kitchen, found the furthest stool from her dad, and began wolfing down her cold cheese muffin. The tutor was to start the next day. Not too early, as Dad was keen to keep Cassie's mornings calm and unhurried. Even Cassie had agreed with him on that point. Sleep was good, and her household liked a lot of it. Dad sometimes went to bed not long after sundown if he could manage it. Things got a bit later when Mum was home, though, because then they would all sit together at the table to eat and chat. These were some of Cassie's favourite times. One of them usually brought up some puzzle from the day to be nutted out, whether it was why the snow peas in the backyard were doing so much better than those in the front, how the Roman Empire met its demise, or what was on the other side of a black hole. The dictionary had been brought out so many times at dinner that it now sat permanently on the shelf with the cups and mugs. And the rule of no devices at the table had been bent so out of shape to accommodate quick internet searches that Lyra had eventually donated their huge set of the Encyclopaedia Britannica to the local library. Cassie was nervous as the clock ticked around to 10 a.m. Once again, she wished she could have talked to Julian. Just a quick chat on the phone would have helped. She didn't even know if he had his own phone now, or whether he'd even be allowed one at boarding school. She certainly hadn't managed to convince her own parents yet that she needed one. She pulled on the cleaner looking of her 2 pairs of jeans, threw on a t-shirt and raced downstairs into the garden. It was a warm, blue sky day. Dad's sunflowers seemed to have grown overnight. She stood against them to see who was taller. You, by a centimetre. Cassie peered around the sunflowers. The tutor was swinging open the gate, smiling. She felt her cheeks flush with annoyance. How had she arrived so quietly? Are we starting with maths then? Do you want to? No. The tutor raised her eyebrows. I want to start with chocolate chip cookies. Come on, Dad made some this morning for us. The tutor laughed. It was a real laugh. That was a relief. Cassie hated it when people did those fake laughs. You could always tell. After morning tea, which somehow had Dad pulling out his banjo while Cassie groaned with embarrassment, she led Allie back out into the garden. Dad had set up a small table with pens and notebooks and 2 chairs for them to work outside in the shade. All right, what would you like to work on, Cassie? Shall we go with what excites you the most, or with what you're finding hardest to get your head around right now? I'm happy to be guided by you. This wasn't quite what Cassie had expected, but she thought about it seriously. Writing, drawing, and making stuff with her hands had felt fun and fairly effortless for her. She'd always envied Julian's musical abilities. But she wasn't sure whether Allie knew anything about music. Dad did. He'd tried teaching her a few things on the piano. She kind of knew that she'd probably enjoy it and be okay at it if she tried. No, it wouldn't be useful for her to ask Allie about music. That left maths. Violetta's face flashed into her mind, and she thought of the wounded textbook lying on her floor. Allie cocked her head to one side and searched Cassie's face. Could she sense Violetta's ghost? Cassie frowned and looked down. I would like to learn maths. I should be up to year 11, but I'm not yet. That sounds like a fine plan, said Allie. We shall start with maths. They spent all afternoon in the garden that day, and for the rest of the week. They began with the basics so that Allie could work out what level she was working at, using cherry tomatoes and calendula flowers when they needed to make things tangible. Allie was kind and patient, and had a way of sensing when Cassie was frustrated. At these times, she would stop them for a break, get Cassie running or climbing. She told her jokes and made sure she ate and drank. They moved on to graphs shaped like hills and valleys and umbrellas, and finally, Cassie was shading under curves and learning the words of calculus, integration, differentiation. They sounded like incantations to Cassie, as though she and Allie were calling up some universal magic, the beginnings of a secret path that, if Cassie followed it far enough, could lead her to a place where space and time ceased, a place where Violetta still existed. Are you doing something fun on the weekend? Allie asked her on Friday as they sat sipping peach iced tea. No, not really. Mum's still going to be away. Do you have any friends nearby? No, not anymore. Oh, really? Yeah, he's gone to boarding school. We used to hang out all the time. I'm sorry to hear that. What's his name? Julian. To say his name hurt a bit. Cassie frowned and took a sip of her tea. Allie sat back. You're good friends by the sound of it. I don't know now. We had a fight before he left and I never got to say sorry. Oh, Cassie, that's rough. Yeah. A jolt of excitement ran through her then. Hey, do you want me to show you the forest? I could show you his house. It's really beautiful. It's a big old place with pretty gardens. Allie sat forward again, her eyes luminous. Sure, why not? They slurped down the rest of their iced tea and jumped up. I'll just go tell Dad. By the time Cassie had returned, Ali was outside the front gate with a wide, conspiratorial smile on her face. Cassie felt a glow of warmth for her tutor, and the restless feeling in her body that told her it was time for an adventure. But as they reached the edge of the forest, her heart started thumping. Somehow she'd pushed aside the memory of the giant dogs, but now the thought of their howls behind her made her shiver. Ali noticed. "You okay?" She took a deep breath. "Yep, let's go in. It's this way." When they got to the bridge, with no sign of anything bigger than a thrush along their way, Cassie felt her tension ease. "Do you want to come across with me?" "Of course," said Ali. "Just be careful, it's a little slippery in places." The water seemed faster and higher than usual with all the unseasonal summer rain, and the bridge wobbled more with a grown-up on it. Cassie had the momentary vision of it snapping beneath them, but luckily Ali was a skinny kind of grown-up, and they reached the other side safely. Cassie ran to the opening in the forest that was the border of the Walcott's property. "Wow!" Ali was behind her. "I see what you mean. Who'd have thought this grand old place was nestled in here? Neat, huh? Who lives here now?" "Just Julian's dad, grumpy old John Walcott." They crept forward, stepping softly across the mossy areas between the big old rhododendrons that Cassie, Julian, and Violetta had spent so many days picnicking amongst. It felt so different without them, colder, as though the trees and shrubs were turned inwards, keeping themselves to themselves, grumbling to each other about strangers. "Let's go back," whispered Cassie, more sharply than she had intended. "Yes, let's." Elisa turned around. "Feels a bit funny, doesn't it?" Perhaps it shouldn't have surprised her by now to know that Ali could feel these kinds of things too. It was just that so many people couldn't. They hurried across the bridge, and Cassie felt much better once they'd made it back to the proper side. The sun flooded the forest floor with a diffuse golden light as they wandered back home. "Ah, I love a forest when it's like this," Ali said, skipping ahead along the track. "I know! Isn't it beautiful? Doesn't it almost make you believe in elves and fairies?" Her tutor turned and smiled, her silver eyes uncanny in the forest's glow. "It sure does."